And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
Now you just can't leave.
Myth number one is that you cannot leave the Mafia. Who said that? Where do these content creators get this bullshit? And I can tell you where it comes from. It comes from them watching films and reading books and believing ghost stories. That's where this comes from. And it's not true at all, and it's never been true. Plenty of guys have left the life and went on to do other things. Books and films have long distorted the myth that once one joins the mob, they cannot leave under except penalty of death. All too many times, weasel content creators and mob pundits get this wrong. And I really don't know where the myth comes from, because the reality is when a guy leaves that life, his rackets, his businesses are all turned over to somebody else, and the machine just keeps going. And if you actually look into FBI files long enough, you will find that it's never ever stated by informants. Rather, it's quite the contrary. Informants have repeatedly told the FBI, because most of you want to believe rats, so let's go with that. But not a single informant has ever told the FBI that they have to stay or they're going to die. In fact, what they do tell them is that they can walk away anytime they want. It's their choice. The rule, according to several made and several former informants, is that in the old days, if you left, the promise was you could not engage in criminal activity. So if you wanted to walk, you had to tell them, I will not engage in any more criminal activity whatsoever. And if you look, for instance, at the case of Joe Bonanno, when the mob shelved him for his attempt to overthrow the commission, there were conditions that went with his shelving that were that he would not engage in any criminal activity under penalty of death. And as we know, Joe Bonanno did attempt to regain a foothold on the West Coast and did get caught up in criminality once again. But the time that happens, the old guard of the mob is gone. The biggest myth is that you can't leave the life. You can. You have to stop watching films and believing that as being fact.
Zany will move against you first. He'll set up a meeting with someone that you absolutely trust, guaranteeing your safety. And at that meeting, you'll be assassinated.
Mob myth number two, The Godfather. For starters, The Godfather is not a real film. Too many mob pundits believe everything they see in this film is an accurate representation of the life. But that's not what we're talking about today. The old saying is that Don Corleone, played by Marlon Brando, was based on one single mob boss. But that isn't true. In fact, Puzo made the character Don Corleone after several infamous mob bosses. Don Corleone was based on the following men: Joe Bonanno, Joe Profaci, and Frank Costello. Now, obviously, the Genco Olive Oil Company was based on Cola Vita olive oil juggernaut Joe Profaci. The calm, raspy demeanor of Don Corleone was actually based on Frank Costello. as Don Corleone had judges and politicians in his pocket, much like Costello did. Don Corleone's alleged honorable traits, if you can believe that, were largely based on Joe Bonanno. However, Puzo obviously didn't know several things at the time about Joe Bonanno. For Bonanno did write a tell-all book, denied selling drugs, and even gave information to the feds about his enemies. So there is mob myth number 2, busted. Mob myth number 3, the mob began in New York City. The American Mafia did not begin in New York. It actually began in New Orleans, Louisiana. While Italian immigrants came from the old country to New York in the 19th and 20th century, believe it or not, the crux of what would become the Mafia was more Dixie than anything else. In 1869, Sicilian gangsters would arrive in New Orleans. Hitmen, counterfeiters, blackmails, and extortioners would form together in 1869 as one criminal group. We would know them as the Black Hand, but the first mob family recognized there would be the Matranga crime family. It would lead the first mob war in U.S. history between the Matranga crime family and the Provenzanos. They would war over the New Orleans waterfront. As violence spilled over and men got killed, it would lead to the world's largest mass lynching of Italians in U.S. history.
What the hell did the Chico need this meeting for? I got shopping to do.
Probably another beef about the fucking garbage routes.
Yeah, more garbage. It's gonna cost us another $20 to park this thing. And we ought to get into these Manhattan parking lots. It's a license to steal. All right, let me out.
Mob myth number 4, you cannot whack a boss without the approval of the commission. And that's not true. The reality is there's a saying that you cannot kill a boss without the expressed permission of the commission. But the reality is this rule was designed and incorporated after Lucky Luciano whacked both Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano to take over the entire mafia. So much for the rules, right? The rule applies, it would seem, when business gets interrupted, and not for the moral implication that you might suspect. While the idea seems incorruptible by moral ambiguity, the reality is when business gets interrupted, that's when the bullets begin to fly. We often hear, John Gotti broke the rules. But really, what rules? Vito Genovese tried to kill Frank Costello. Then he helps aid Carlo Gambino in the murdering of Albert Anastasia. Anastasia himself, no stranger to killing, actually whacked the boss of his own family, Vincent Mangano, and then killed his brother Philip Mangano. Angelo Bruno was assassinated by Antonio Caponegro with the belief that the Genovese crime family backed him, and then stupidly goes to New York to answer for that crime. Funzi Thierry, who had told Caponegro that the murder was greenlit, stunningly is shocked when he's called before the commission, and Thierry denies ever giving him permission to do that. And how does Caponegro's life end? He never leaves that meeting. And they find him in a trunk a few weeks later in the Bronx. Time and time again, Phil Testa, another example of another boss whacked without permission. This has been a historical thing from day one. So you cannot pick and choose which one was wrong for doing it, because going all the way back to the heyday of the Mafia, Lucky Luciano killed 2 bosses to take over. So the odds are the rule really doesn't exist unless you want to push that rule. John Gotti did the same thing that those before him did. So the rule applies when they feel like applying it. And the commission, sadly, has turned a blind eye to murder of bosses since the early days. So it's not actually a rule.